Welcome to Dark Corners with David Allen Voyles. Dark Corners is brought to you by Gestalt Media, an independent publishing company dedicated to serving independent authors. The Toymaker. Merry Christmas, Boris Stoylovska. Are we ready to receive our visitor? He should be arriving any minute. Boris grunted but nodded to the portly man standing in the doorway of his stable as he placed a large push broom into the storage closet. He locked the door and turned to face his guest while wiping his hands on his dirty vest. Yes, we're ready. Although I don't see why I have to move my horses out to Anton Petrov's farm every December. Now, Boris, said the mayor, it's a Christmas tradition that's happened every year for as long as anyone in this village can remember. Surely it's the least we can do at such a special time of year. It's easy for you to say, Ivan. You're not the one who has to clean out an entire stable and turn it into a shop. He spat into the straw at his feet. And pray that the old fool don't burn down your property. It's hardly a shop, Boris, and the townspeople compensate you well for your inconvenience. Old Nick comes but once a year. Boris grunted again in answer, and stood staring at the mayor, who just smiled and shook his head. The sound of a horse's hooves on the hard-packed dirt road and the creaking wheels of an old wagon broke the silence. The two men left the gloomy stable and walked into the cold air to greet the visitor. The driver of the wagon wore a long, fur-trimmed brown cloak, belted with a broad strap of leather that was clasped with a buckle surprisingly ornate for a man of modest means. Locks of his long, white hair tried to escape from the hood which obscured much of his face, and his beard cascaded down to his waist. The contents of the wagon, which appeared to be boxes of various sizes, were covered by a tarp. Old Nick climbed down from his wagon seat with an agility that belied his age, while the mayor stood with his hands behind his back, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. When the old man looked at him with piercing blue eyes, Ivan gave the visitor a small, nervous smile. You have served your village well, Ivan Zelenogorsky, and you honor the old ways. He turned a stern gaze to Boris and said, Many do not. Boris shuffled his feet and looked at the ground. Softening his tone, the visitor added, But I am grateful for the use of your stable and for the labor you expended on my account. Boris nodded without looking up. I assume you need no assistance in your preparations? The mayor asked. The old man shook his head. Then I shall leave you, for I know you have much to do and your visitors will be starting to arrive at sunset. The old man turned without saying a word as he began to untie the covering from his wagon. The mayor patted Boris on the arm and walked away, leaving Boris to watch the unloading of the wagon. Boris felt he should say something, and as always was most anxious to know what secrets might lie under the tarp. Sure you don't need help unloading them goods? Old Nick shook his head and continued to work his way around the wagon. All right, then. You know where you can put the wagon and your horse. There's grain and water in the usual places, and I'll have my wife bring out a meal for you shortly. Taking the old man's silence as acceptance, Boris walked to his cottage, barely able to restrain himself from throwing a curious glance back at the wagon. The woman sat at a small table, staring at an open locket in her lap. A little blonde girl with dark eyes looked back at her from the tiny portrait. Are you certain you want to do this, Magda? A man stood behind her, still wearing his hat and woolen coat. Wet droplets from melted snowflakes sparkled on his shoulders as they caught bits of light from the blazing fire. He placed his hands on his wife's shoulders with deep concern in his eyes. Magda nodded and wiped her eyes with the handkerchief she had been clenching. Kirill crossed to a wooden chest covered with an embroidered quilt which stood against the wall. He opened the trunk and removed a small doll with yellow hair and soft, delicate features that was wearing a blue dress. We should leave soon, he said. The wagon's ready. Wouldn't you like to eat something first? Magda asked as she stood and ran her hands down the front of her apron. He shook his head. Some bread and cheese, at least? I said no. Kyril's expression softened as he saw the hurt in his wife's eyes. I'm sorry. He went to her and held her. This is just so hard. For both of us. He felt Magda's head nod in agreement as she pressed against his chest, and he heard a soft gasp as she tried to stifle a sob. Then she pushed herself back from him, dried her tears once again as she looked up into his face and attempted a small smile. But we can't accept this one gift, she said. Kyril returned the smile and hugged her again.
Meow!
The cat yowled and hissed as Tatiana gripped it by the tail to keep it from leaving her lap, where she held it against its will. When it struck the girl's hand with lightning speed, Tatiana released it with a cry and ran to show her father. "Look what Whiskers did to me, Papa," she whined. A red welt ran across the back of her pale, small hand. Her brother Valko looked up from the dinner table where he was writing and laughed. "I knew I should have drowned all the kittens in that litter," Peter Krastovic said. "You promised to feed and take care of it, but it's fallen on your poor mother to care for the creature. She has spoiled you for certain." "Eleanor does it, not Mama," said Tatiana. "And that's what servants are for." Ignoring her comment, Peter noticed for the first time that his son had been engrossed in a project. "What are you working on, Valko?" he asked. "It's not like you to be working on your lessons while on holiday. In fact, if Schoolmaster Andonov made such an assignment, I'll need to have a word with him." "I'm making a list of things I want from Old Nick. Last year all I got was a carved wagon that broke before the new year. This year I'm listing all the things I want." "That's not how it works," Tatiana said, lifting her nose high in a posture of authority, as she had seen her father do when speaking to the servants. "You have to pick something out from the toys that Old Nick has brought." "Maybe that's how it has worked, but that doesn't mean it always has to work that way. If I give Old Nick a list, then next year I might get something I really want. Right, Papa?" Peter smiled at his son's cleverness. "I like how you're planning ahead," he said. "That is precisely the kind of initiative I expect in someone who will work beside me one day." "Excuse me, sir." Peter turned to see the maid standing at the doorway that led into the kitchen. "Madam has asked me to set the table early this evening, as it's Christmas Eve." "I'm perfectly aware of what night it is, Eleanor," Peter snapped. He sighed and turned to his son. And where is my wife, anyway?" "She's not feeling well, sir, and has taken to her bed. She asked me to tell you that you'll need to take the children into the village without her, as she is indisposed." Peter gave a great sigh of disgust. 3 glasses of rakia before sunset. I knew that would be a problem, he thought. "Valko, move your papers from the table so we can eat and then get on our way. You children don't want to miss seeing Old Nick, do you? Both of you, go wash up." Tatiana got up immediately, her face bright with the excitement of the evening ahead, and stepped briskly on her way out of the room. Valko lagged a bit, letting his sister go first, and then, grinning slyly, he kicked her foot from behind. "For the love of God, watch where you're going," her father said as she tumbled to the floor with a scream. Valko laughed heartily and skipped around her, deftly avoiding Tatiana's angry punch. Holding his head in his hands, Peter moaned, "I'll be glad when Christmas is finally over." A line of parents and children had formed outside Boris Stoylovska's stable. The light from the torches Boris had positioned along the path flickered on their smiling faces. Although the children were undoubtedly excited, they were never so behaved as when they stood waiting to see Old Nick. Their parents were happy as well, but a sense of uncertainty about the old Toymaker curbed their gaiety to a small degree. One couple at the front of the line, however, did not share the same spirit of holiday cheer. Magda Parchovich clutched a small doll with yellow hair and a blue dress as she stood anxiously beside her husband. She jumped when the stable door opened, and a boy of about 10 years, holding a kite, and a girl much younger who was obviously delighted with the small stuffed dog she held came out with their parents. No one stood at the stable door to conduct the young couple's entrance, so looking at each other with just a moment of hesitation, they drew in a breath and stepped into the lantern light. "Close the door behind you, please," said the old bearded man who was seated on a barrel. It was not Magda or Kirill's first visit to see Old Nick, but the sense of wonder was no less at what they saw. Lanterns hung around the stable revealed hundreds of toys that were positioned on shelves that covered the walls and on wooden boxes that had been turned upside down to display them. They both felt like children again as they looked at the array of toys. The old man allowed them time to take in the sight, and then, when they finally turned their attention to him, he held out his hand for the yellow-haired doll that Magda had brought and said in a quiet, soft voice, "Now, tell me about your loss." Stefan and Antonia exchanged nervous glances as they stood in the line of excited villagers. They were new to the village, and they did not know what to expect when meeting the old Toymaker about whom they had only recently heard. They left most of the few belongings they owned in the city when they accepted the offer from Antonia's cousin to work on his farm. Gabriella had even lost her favorite stuffed animal. The little girl had been so brave and uncomplaining about their new life that Stefan and Antonia were thrilled when they heard about Old Nick's visit. "What do I say to Old Nick?" asked Gabriella as she looked up into her parents' faces. Before they could answer, Mayor Selenogorsky, who was standing behind them with his own family, spoke up. "Well, whatever you do, do not refer to him as Old Nick," he said, not unkindly. "That's just the name we've given him. It would be a sign of gross disrespect to call him by that name to his face." "So what should we call him?" asked Gabriella. "Well, it's best not to call him anything," said the mayor. "Well, what should we say?" asked Stefan. "You really don't have to say anything. Old Nick already knows about you, rest assured. Just answer any questions he may ask, and remember to be as respectful as possible." Antonia and Stefan nodded assent along with their daughter, looking just as innocent and childlike as she did. The door opened, and a family beaming with joy left the stable. "Looks like it's your turn," said the mayor. "Good luck." Stefan and Antonia entered the stable, each with a hand on one of their daughter's shoulders. Gabriella's mouth dropped open as she looked about the space. The soft light cast a golden glow on all the toys. "Merry Christmas," said the old man. "Is this heaven?" asked the child in a very small voice. The old toy maker laughed and said, "No, it's just a stable. Come here, child, and talk to me." He held out his arms, but looked to her parents for their permission. They both nodded together, too much in awe to be able to speak, and once again looking like children themselves. Old Nick gently pulled Gabriella up on his knee and said, "If I'm not mistaken, Gabriella, you lost something very dear to you when you moved to this village." Stefan and Antonia looked at each other in amazement. Gabriella nodded and said, "Leo, my lion." Our stuffed animals are often as precious to us as our live pets, but maybe you can find something here that will help you feel better about losing Leo. Take a walk around the stable and see if you can find something you like. Gabriella hopped down from Old Nick's lap and began looking at all the toys. There were so many to see that her parents wondered how she could ever be able to decide. The old toy maker stood and followed behind her to see what she might pick. She walked slowly among the boxes and looked up carefully at all the shelves. Finally, she picked up a stuffed black cat that looked a bit worn. It was in good repair, but clearly it was a used toy. "May I have this one, please?" The old man smiled and nodded. Turning to her parents, he said, "Your daughter is a very special little girl. There are lots of new toys here, including new stuffed animals. But among the toys I make, I also include toys from children who have outgrown them. These toys have received much love from their owners, and they have given great happiness in return. Your daughter has chosen a toy filled with such love." Hugging the little cat tightly, Gabriella came up to the old Toymaker and said, "Thank you, sir." "You're quite welcome," said the old man. He returned to the barrel on which he had been sitting and nodded his head in farewell as they left the stable. Peter Kastrovich was not used to waiting for what he wanted, and certainly not used to waiting behind peasants. When the stable door opened and the family who had stood before them in the line exited the stable, he breathed a sigh of relief and exclaimed, "Thank God." The children ran into the stable and immediately over to the barrels of toys closest to them. Tatiana picked up toys with both hands, inspected them, and then tossed them back, not minding when they fell off and tumbled into the straw on the stable floor. Valko was a bit more reserved, but his eyes gleamed nevertheless. As he perused the carved figures of wagons, trains, soldiers, and puzzle pieces on the tops of various barrels, he became less enthused. Suddenly, as if the thought had just struck him, he walked over to where the Toymaker sat and pulled a paper from his pocket. "Here, old Nick," Valko said, handing the list to the Toymaker. "Lest I forget, I thought I'd make a list for you of things that I would really like to have next Christmas. You may not know much about boys my age, but I've outgrown most of the toys you bring." The old Toymaker's eyes narrowed, and he studied the child in front of him. "Quite the resourceful lad, don't you think?" said Peter Krastovich. "Takes after his father, I must say." "Yes, I quite agree," said the Toymaker solemnly. Valko resumed his survey of the toys and walked over to where his sister was winding the key in the back of a small mechanical man. She set it down on the floor of the stable where it began to march across the straw. "Hey, that's quite good," said Valko, picking it up. "That's mine," said Tatiana. "I saw it first." "Well, I've got it now. Finders keepers, losers weepers, as they say. Go find something else. There are many toys here that are more fitting for babies like you." The Toymaker stood in front of the barrel where he had been sitting. The light shining up on his frowning face and the huge shadow it cast on the wall behind him made him a frightening figure. In a quiet voice, he said, "All of you must leave now." "But I haven't got a toy," protested Tatiana. "It is just children being children," said Peter. "I always say it's best to let them work these things." The old man turned his stern gaze on Mr. Krastovich, who spoke not another word. The Toymaker walked across the stable and opened the door. Peter motioned for the children to leave, and they slowly complied. As Valko passed the old man, the Toymaker held out his hand to receive the mechanical toy. Valko's eyes flared in indignation. "That's not fair!" he cried. The old man said nothing, but continued to stare at the boy with his hand extended. Valko thrust the toy into his hand and stomped out behind his sister. Peter Krastovich followed his children out the door without making eye contact. "Wake up! Wake up!" Valko shook his sister, who sat up in her bed rubbing her eyes. "Is it time for presents?" she asked through a big yawn. "Yes, but not the way you're thinking. Get dressed and I'll tell you." 15 minutes later, the children were walking down the moonlit road to town. A light snow was falling, but the road was still quite easy to manage. From time to time, Valko would get far ahead of his sister, and he would have to stop and wait for her to catch up. Once he was so far ahead he could just barely make out her red coat in the moonlight when he turned around to check on her. Sighing in exasperation, he walked back towards her. "I don't want to go to the stable, Valky," she whined as he approached. "Old Nick is scary." "Don't you want to get your toy?" asked her brother, grabbing her gloved hand and pulling her along. "I know I do." "You got lots of toys already, and you'll get more this morning. Better ones." "It's not the same," Valko said. His mouth was clenched tight as he stomped through the snow. "And I'm not going to let him win." The torches that had lit the area outside the stable earlier were extinguished, but the moon cast enough light for the children to see their way to the door. Valko placed a finger on his lips as he slowly pulled the latch up to enter. He opened the door a crack, only enough for him to peep in. The stable was lit as before with many lanterns. The barrel where the old Toymaker had sat was bare. Valko did not see the old man anywhere in the stable. He opened the door wider and tiptoed in with his sister right behind. The two children stood in the center of the stable as they looked all around. On every wall, toys lined the shelves. As before, toys also sat on boxes. Valko could not imagine how the Toymaker could have brought so many toys, for even his father's large wagon could not have held them all. He was relieved to see that in spite of the long line of children that had waited to see Old Nick, there were still plenty of toys left. In fact, no space was left vacant. The Toymaker must have had replacements for every toy that was chosen. "Valky, where's Old Nick?" "I don't know," he whispered, "but be quiet before you ruin everything. Just pick out whatever toys you want and we'll go home." Valko moved closer to the wall of toys where Tatiana had found the mechanical man before. Whatever he did, he knew he would leave with that toy. "I don't like it here," said Tatiana tearfully. "The toys are looking at me." "Stop being such a baby, Tatya," her brother scolded. But then out of the corner of his eye, he saw a clown and a conical hat that was sitting on one of the highest shelves turn his head in Valko's direction. A thump behind the children caused them to turn around, where they saw a bean bag that had fallen to the straw floor from the shelf where it had apparently been sitting. A grinning stuffed monkey crouched, posed in a position as if it had just pushed the bag from its proper place. A familiar whirring noise made Valko and Tatiana turn again, and they saw the little mechanical man strutting across the top of a large barrel, the key turning in its back. Tatiana clutched her brother's arm and held him tight, and for once, Valko did not push her away. As they looked about the stable, they saw that the heads of every doll and stuffed animal were turned or tilted to peer at them as they stood in the center of the stable. And it seemed to the children that although all of them were smiling, the looks were not kind. A small noise directed the children's attention to the clown in the conical hat that Valko had first noticed. It was moving. It scooted to the edge of the shelf and then launched itself to the ground, where it rolled to a sitting position. And then standing up, it dusted itself off, placed its hands on its hips, and tilted its head as it grinned at Tatiana and Valko. What happened next caused Valko to be nearly overcome with vertigo. There was movement among the toys all along the shelves on the three walls that he could see. In a panic, he turned to see what was happening behind him, and was horrified to find that those toys were no longer on boxes or shelves, but were standing on the floor, an army of teddy bears, dolls, stuffed ponies, and dogs. Tatiana squealed, and Valko turned around again to see that the toys he had just observed stirring slightly a second ago were now pouring off the shelves, many already on the ground advancing towards them. The little clown led the vanguard, its miniature painted face still grinning horribly, and then it threw back its head and filled the stable with its tinny, high-pitched laughter. A murmur of quiet but shrill voices mixed with quiet purring, heavy panting, and excited whining as the wave of toys got closer and closer. Valko and Tatiana sank to their knees, holding each other and staring with wide eyes, too terrified even to cry. Raina and Peter Krastovich sipped their tea in the parlor in front of their beautiful Christmas tree. "Is your headache better, my dear?" asked Peter with a smile devoid of genuine sympathy. "I'm fine," said Raina, her hand shaking so that it spilled her tea as she set her teacup in its saucer. but I would like to get on with Christmas morning. It's most unusual for the children not to be down yet." "Why not enjoy the peace and quiet for once?" said her husband as he tore off another chunk of the spiraled pastry on the plate before him. He frowned as he placed the morsel in his mouth and said, "I wish this banitsa had been made this morning. It's much better when it's warm." He licked his fingers and wiped them on the doily that covered the arm of his stuffed chair. "If you hadn't given Eleanor the day off, she could have made it this morning," she said as she stood and made her way to the staircase. "And now I am forced to make lunch and dinner for all of us. And on Christmas Day. But then that is so like you, Peter, only thinking of yourself." "Where are you going?" he asked. "To wake the children. It's late and I want to get this over with so I can rest before I have to prepare our dinner." As Peter poured himself another cup of tea, he heard his wife's muffled gasp, followed by her quick footsteps back toward the railing where she had called down from upstairs. "Peter, come quickly, the children! They're gone!" A moment later, Peter stood beside his wife at the doorway to the children's room. Their beds were unmade, and the clothes they had worn the day before were missing instead of lying on other pieces of furniture as usual. Tatiana's white nightgown lay on the floor, and Valko's striped nightshirt was wadded up on his bed. "Where could they be?" asked Raina in a strained voice. Peter crossed the room to the window and threw back the curtain, giving him a full view of the large yard where the children frequently played. The snow lay smooth, disturbed only by the small prints made by birds and squirrels. Magda stood at the window, looking out at the gently falling snow as she pulled a blanket around herself more tightly. Kirill watched her from the table where he finished the breakfast Magda had made. She had prepared more food than what she normally made for the two of them each morning, but neither of them had been able to eat. His gaze moved from her to the small Christmas tree which sat on a table well away from the fireplace. 3 gifts lay wrapped beneath its branches. "Mama? Papa?" Magda spun away from the window toward the call. A blonde girl in a blue dress stood in the arched doorway that led to the bedrooms. "Katya?" Magda practically flew across the room to wrap her arms around the girl. Kirill stood, not believing his eyes. His wife was sobbing with joy, only able to stop hugging her child for seconds in order to pull back in order to see her face, and then hugging her again. Kirill slowly approached the two, who smiled at his approach and included him in their embrace. When they finally found their voices, Magda sat down beside the girl, holding her hands, unable to make herself break contact. "I've missed you so much," Magda said. "I know," said Katerina, "but I can only spend 1 day with you. At sunset, I'll be gone." Magda's eyes filled with tears again, and she looked at Kirill. "I don't know if we can stand to lose you again." "I know it makes you sad," she said, "but I want you to know that I am fine. I am happy, and you should be too. But we have today to be together as a family." Kirill looked at the girl intently and asked, "Katya, is it really you?" Instead of answering, the girl only looked at him and smiled. "I have breakfast for you if you'd like," said Magda, standing and pulling Katerina towards the table. "Come, I've made malinka, your favorite, with marmalade. Let's all sit down and enjoy a lovely Christmas breakfast." Magda was too excited to eat, and she could not stop herself from frequently reaching across the small table to touch the back of Katerina's hand or to tuck a stray lock of hair behind the girl's ear, reassuring herself constantly that her Katya was really there. Kirill and Katerina laughed each time she did it, and the two of them were able to eat the entire pastry that Magda had made. When Katerina began to gather the plates to clean them, Magda cried, "No, Katya, I'll do that. You go sit with your father, and then we'll all take a walk on this glorious Christmas day. And afterwards, we'll play games and work puzzles just like we used to." "You know, I will have to leave you at sunset," repeated Katerina softly. "I know," Magda said, and her voice cracked only a little. "But I will be so grateful for the time we've had. And even though I will still miss you, I can be at peace knowing that you will be happy even after you're gone." Katerina nodded, and then she took Kyril's hand and led him back to the couch. "Now, tell me all the stories that I have missed, like the tricks that Andrei has played on poor old Uncle Grozdan, and the lies that Georgy Kokolov has told about his feats as a great hunter." Gabriella sat up on the pallet where she slept near the fire, stretched her arms, and yawned. The stuffed black cat lay on her lap. "Merry Christmas, little one," said her mother, Antonia, who was stirring a pot on the wood stove. "Are you ready for some breakfast?" Gabriella nodded excitedly and got up, taking care to set her new toy to the side before she rolled up the thin blankets and stored them with her pillow in the other room of the house where her parents slept. Just as Gabriella returned to the main room, the door to their small cottage opened, and Stefan entered carrying a small fir tree that he had just cut down. "Papa!" Gabriella exclaimed, clapping her hands together while giving an excited little hop. "You brought us a Christmas tree!" "I did," said her father, "and I made a stand for it as well. Now, where do you suppose we should put it?" He gave a sly wink to his wife. Gabriella put her little fist under her chin and paused to think, just as she had often seen her mother do. Then she pointed to a corner of the room that had already been cleared for that purpose. "Gabriella, perhaps you could help me cut pretty ornaments for the tree from the paper I used to wrap our dishes when we moved," said Antonia. "Yes, we can make snowflakes like we did last Christmas." While Stefan settled the tree in the corner, Antonia poured the breakfast porridge she had made into 3 bowls. As they ate, Gabriella told her parents about the dream she had had the night before. It was Christmas, and under the tree were 2 presents just for me. "Did you open them?" asked Stefan. "No, I woke up before I could unwrap them," Gabriella answered. Stefan gave Antonia a sad little smile. They both lamented that they had been unable to get something for her this year. "But I did get Midnight, and she's wonderful," said Gabriella. She jumped up and ran to where she had left her new stuffed toy. But on the way to fetch Midnight, something caught Gabriella's eye. "Look, Mama, there's a gift under the tree. 2 gifts!" Stefan and Antonia stood up from the table to see what Gabriella had seen, and much to their surprise, 2 small objects wrapped in white paper and tied up with red ribbon lay under the tree. "Did you?" Antonia asked in a low voice to her husband. "No, I didn't put anything there. I just put the tree in place." "Can I open them? Please, Mama? Please, Papa?" Stefan looked at Antonia, who shrugged. "I suppose so, but, Gabby, I don't know who they're from or how they got there." Gabriella tore the paper off the first item and saw that it was a doll, a little girl with dark hair that was wearing a bright red coat. Squealing with delight, she opened the second gift and found that it was a doll too, although this one was of a boy who also had dark hair, but who appeared to be a little bit older. "They are brother and sister," announced Gabriella, "and I will make up stories about them and they can act them out." "I wonder what you'll call these mysterious dolls," said Antonia, who gave her husband a quizzical look, still not accepting his word that he had not put the gifts under the tree. Stefan returned her look with wide eyes and a shrug, protesting his innocence. "Oh, they have names," Gabriella said. "The girl is Tatiana, and the boy is Valko." "How do you know this?" asked Stefan. "I just do," she said. Boris watched as old Nick tied off the last corner of the tarp that covered the load in his wagon. "I still don't know how you managed to get all them toys in this single wagon," he said. The Toymaker ignored his statement and climbed nimbly up to the seat of the wagon. "Thank you for the use of the stable, Boris Stoylovska. I imagine we will meet again next Christmas." As the wagon pulled away, Boris stood in the snow and watched him drive out of sight. "Strange old buzzard," he said aloud, although no one was there. "I do all this work, and the brats get the presents." Shaking his head, he entered the stable to see if he needed to clean up any mess the old man had left behind, although that had never been the case. The only thing left, as it was every year, sat on the top of one of Boris's barrels. a single lump of coal. That concludes this episode of Dark Corners with David Allen Voyles. Music for Dark Corners was written and performed by Mombi Uhlman and can be purchased at mombiuhlman.bandcamp.com. If you'd like to hear more holiday horror stories by David Allen Voyles, you can find his short story collection, The 13th Day of Christmas and Other Tales of Yuletide Horror, on gestaltmedia.com. Hope we see you again in the dark corners.